Hello, my name is Alex Isles and welcome to Ad Gefrin in Northumberland, this royal palace of the kings of Northumbria. Now in today's episode we're going to talk about the Great Palisade Enclosure that was here at Ad Gefrin. So when Brian Hope Taylor was excavating the site, he discovered a gigantic enclosure. Now initially when he first did the excavations, he believed that this could actually be some form of Celtic hill fort in the lowlands, because he had excavated the site up here of Yevering Bell, where there was an Iron Age hill fort on the hill up there. Now when he excavated that, he was looking for a continuation from the Iron Age period right the way into this new period of the early Middle Ages, that post-Roman period where the Roman authority had gone and now you had the new Germanic Anglo-Saxons coming in. And he wanted to show that there was a British site on this period that then was then adopted by the Anglo-Saxons and became Ad Gefrin. When he did that, he was looking and he couldn't really find anything on top of Yevering Bell. He did find one palisade enclosure, but I'll tackle that in another video because that's complicated in its own right. But this palisade enclosure here seems to have been built in phase 2 of the site. So we know that there was a mound over there with a Bronze Age burial in, and that mound then had Anglo-Saxon burial remains buried into it, which is around about 25 to 75 years older, Brian Hope Taylor thought, than the Great Palisade Enclosure right here. Then obviously when the Great Palisade Enclosure is built, they also build the hall and the Germanic temple on a north-south line over there in the western side of the site right here. But over here in the east, the Great Palisade Enclosure is built. So double lines of planks are put in with a gap in the middle and then another line of planks, 2 palisades that create this site. It then ends in 2 large ring terminals which are large enough to have a hall on the inside in the later periods. Now when looking at this, he thought, well, is this an example of the Britons creating a fort for defence on the ground? But over the time of his writing he started to assess it more and he thought, this doesn't look like a fort and it's not that defensible. What is it instead? And instead he came up with the concept that this was actually for cattle, this was for livestock, because back then there wasn't a coin-based economy as such. And when there wasn't a coin-based economy, what the kings would do is they would actually tax goods instead of taxing money. And so when they taxed goods, you can imagine all of the lords of northern Britain coming together, bringing their herds of cattle that have been taxed, and they're bringing them here to Ad Gefrin, where they're put inside this gigantic enclosure right here. And when they're placed inside the enclosure, then the king has ritual feasting and honouring his men, giving out gifts and then meeting together. And then during this period as well, when this is built, they build the grandstand. And so then that's another way that then when he's got all of these people coming together to be taxed, the king is then able to address all of his lords here and show his power. And visiting kings as well can see both the grandstand and the enclosure and see the power of these Northumbrian kings up here. And so because of that, Brian Hope Taylor developed that idea, and as he developed that idea, it then continued, and in phase 3, which has got an A, B and C phase, as the palace continues to gain more and more prestige, the halls are extended and it becomes even grander. At the end of phase 3 there's a fire that destroys most of the site and damages the grandstand. The palisade enclosure here gets damaged as well, and it seems to be the final stand of maybe the people here at Ad Gefrin. And in fact there is charred remains, and the burial site actually shows that when people are buried in and around this area, they're buried alongside a lot of charcoal in the ground as well. So maybe it was more rushed burials to suggest that these people, after they'd been killed during the raid, were then buried into the ground as well. But after that, in phase 4, the Great Palisade Enclosure has then increased in size. It's made larger, and in phase 4 you see a really grand palace right here until it too is destroyed by fire. When it's destroyed by fire, the Great Palisade Enclosure is never rebuilt, and the phase 5 site just has a couple of halls, and it seems to be important. But then this links in with what Bede says, and Bede says that then Ad Gefrin was then replaced by Mailman, which would later become Millfield, slightly further along the valley in Northumberland. So when that happens, historians are very much sort of like can draw parallels or put opinions that it was suddenly just like a sudden stop, bam, over and done with. We're leaving Ad Gefrin, it's been burnt to the ground, we're not going to bother with Ad Gefrin anymore, we're going to Mailman. But instead it seems like there's much more of a continuation, because the buildings here, they stay in sight, they're not demolished, they actually stay here until they rot and then collapse. So maybe it's a lot longer of a sort of a phased out approach where Ad Gefrin becomes less and less important, and instead Mailman becomes more important as well. And there's a couple of different factors to assess with that. First of all, the Great Palisade Enclosure here as a taxation point for the kings of Northumbria, well, there's another one of these at Mailman. So because of that, it's a suggestion they built the new Palisade Enclosure at Mailman and they just moved the taxation to there. On top of this as well, you've also had two changes in faith. First of all, you've got the Christianization under Edwin and Oswald, and then following on from that, Oswu, the new king after Oswald's death, he becomes Roman Catholic instead of Celtic Insular Christianity. And so because of that, two shifts in faith from possibly Germanic pagan mixed in with native British to Insular Christianity to Roman Catholicism, that suddenly means the connection to the spiritual location right here with the older temples, the Germanic temples and that sort of thing there is becoming weaker. And so the spiritual connection means that this location here is not necessarily seen as a royal site anymore. And instead Mailman becomes the more royal site. But on top of that as well, they discovered a church built on top of the Great Palisade Enclosure. Now, when this church is built on top of the site, archaeologists have assessed it, and initially, when you read Brian Hope Taylor, he thinks the church built on the site and it just becomes like the church with the palisades, and he just assesses it like that and thinks, oh, okay, the Great Hall plus the church means that this is still a royal site, but then it gets phased out over time. Archaeologists have now assessed that church and looked at it, and there's actually a leading archaeologist who suggests that that could actually be an 8th century church, so it's later than the site. So is it possible that because this site here, afterwards, it does become abandoned, the hall rots away and is left, but a church is then constructed on the site here to remember the saintly King Edwin, saintly King Oswald, and this becomes a very important site for the local people, with the connection to the kings now and Christianity rather than the older spiritualism, and it becomes a church location, a ecclesiastical site rather than a secular powerful site. Not that the kings back then were secular in any idea, they were always connected to the gods or God with their power. So there's a bit of a story of the Palisade Enclosure right here, of this location where you have an Anglo-Saxon taxation site where the kings of Northumbria are bringing their lords to here, taxing them for their goods, and then using that to exert royal power onto the people up here in the northeast of England. I really hope you've enjoyed today's video. As always, please do like and subscribe, write a comment below and I'll try and answer it to the best of my ability. And if you'd like to support the channel, share the videos, and I have a Patreon as well, which you can use to support me too. In the meantime though, stay safe and well, and thank you so much for watching, and I look forward to sharing more history with you in the near future.